What I'd like to talk about is the Masorah of Torah Sheba'al Peh. When it comes to Torah Shebiksav, a Sefer Torah must be 100% perfect. If one letter is either deformed, partially erased, the whole thing's puzzle. We're so careful to make sure it's got every single letter, it's been preserved generation after generation. And although we do find that the Teimanim do have a difference, only in spelling. Only in spelling, there's no difference whatsoever in terms of the content, the meaning. There's a discrepancy with the Teimani Sefer Torah. It's different than everyone else's. But that's as far as it goes. So that's for Torah Shebiksav. Torah Sheba'al Peh, to begin with, the Mishnah was only compiled after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, which means that the entire first and second temple era, and through all the years of the Galus between the two, we did not have the Mishnah. The Gemara was composed even later. They're filled with disagreement, machlokas. How do we know what's authentic and what not? It would seem to be that it's not just a matter of a detail or two that we're missing. It would seem to be that the entire process of the handing down of the oral law and the Masorah over the generations would leave room for asking, was it broken telephone? Do we really know? Besides, is it opinion? The rabbis in the days of the Beis HaMikdash and after, were they making things up? What's authentic? What isn't authentic? So there are a few major issues that have to be discussed here. I'd like to begin, and perhaps this should be required reading at some point in the term. The Rambam writes an introduction to his Mishnah Torah. Mishnah Torah is the Rambam's work. He also has an introduction to the Mishnah, to his commentary on Mishnah. And in both of these, he discusses this at length. There are also some other ideas that we have to talk about, but let's begin with that. Rambam writes, what did Moshe receive at Sinai? He was given the 613 mitzvos with precise definitions. Precise definitions of every one of them. In fact, the definitions that that Moshe got, were so precise that in theory he could have applied them to any situation that will ever come up. Now, Moshe taught the rules to all of Klal Yisrael, the entire nation. First, he taught to Yehoshua. Then he taught them to Aaron and his children. And then he taught them to the whole nation. However, what he taught were the rules. The basic definitions of every mitzvah, the rules, the applications, the basic applications. In terms of that precise definition, where you can apply it to any situation ever. You know, Moshe Rabbeinu had a very good teacher. It was Hashem himself. Moshe understood that it's not possible to give it over in the same precise manner. What he taught them were the rules of every mitzvah, and one more thing. Along with the Torah itself, Moshe received from Hashem the Yud Gimel Midos ShaTorah Nidreshes Bahem, the 13 different ways that we can deduce halacha from the written law. Things like Kal V'chomer, Gzeira Shava, Binyan Av, these are all the different ways that you can deduce halacha from a pasuk. Gzeira Shava, the Torah uses the same word in two different places, so you can apply the halachas of one to the other. Kal V'chomer, the Torah says something, you can certainly apply it to a case that is more severe. There's more reason to apply it to. There are 13 different systems by way you can go and deduce law from Torah Shebiksav. So Moshe told them, here I'm giving you all the definitions of the 613. Any situation that ever arises that wasn't covered by what I told you, use the 13 principles, this is not the 13 principles of faith. This is the 13, Yud Gimel Mido ShaTorah Nidreshes Behem, the 13 different ways of learning things out of psukim, and from there you'll be able to determine the halacha. Over the years after Moshe Rabbeinu's passing, it was always the obligation of the Sanhedrin to apply the Yud Gimel Midos for any situation that arose that was not naturally covered by what they had been taught. So in a certain sense, they were writing halacha, or they were determining halacha that was never said before, but it really was. First of all, because it was included in that precise definition of every mitzvah that Moshe was given. And number two, because Hashem said you can deduce halacha when you can't figure it out by way of the Yud Gimel Midos ShaTorah Nidreshes Behem. Rambam says this always went on. From after Moshe Rabbeinu's passing, every generation was doing this. As new situations arose, they were applying the Yud Gimel Midos. So throughout the Gemara, when we read, not talking about what the Mishnah and the Gemara were, but first, when we read in the Gemara that they go and deduce something from a pasuk, they were using the Yud Gimel Midos ShaTorah Nidreshes Behem to deduce halacha that they were not able to decide on the basis of the actual definitions of the mitzvahs that they got. They were not just making up halacha. They were using the system that Hashem gave Moshe to be used in determining the halacha in new situations. Why were there differing opinions? Says the Rambam. Precisely how to use those 13, it's not a free-for-all. It's a very closed and precise system. And with time, there was disagreement on how to apply it. So long as there was a Sanhedrin, the Torah says they should vote. If there's disagreement, they would vote, and we went by the majority. There were some situations that could not be resolved by the Sanhedrin. We find the very first disagreement took place in the days of the Second Temple era, the beginning of the Second Temple era, where it was just unresolved. The Sanhedrin could not come to a conclusion. Throughout the entire Second Temple era till almost the end, there was one disagreement. The generation before the destruction was the Beis Din of Hillel and Shammai. They disagreed over 3 other situations, and that was it. The generation of the actual destruction of the temple, there were thousands of disagreements. What happened? What happened was there was civil war. If you remember, I brought this up a long time ago. The end of the Second Temple era. The Romans were exerting their pressure. They were about to come to conquer. And within the nation, there was a major disagreement. Do we fight the Romans or do we surrender? What was the question? Unlike any of the other civilizations before that attacked the Jews, the Romans did not have an ideological disagreement with us. They did not have an ideology. There is no such thing as Roman philosophy. They did not have a religion of their own in those days. They were interested in one thing: ruling the world. They allowed every country they conquered to maintain its own culture. All they wanted is that you pay taxes to Rome, consider yourself a puppet state of Rome, and your country got a Roman name. It was the same here. The Romans at that point had no intentions of destroying the temple, interfering with Jewish study or worship in any way whatsoever. As long as we would pay taxes to Rome, instead of calling ourselves Israel, we would call ourselves Philistina. So there was major disagreement in the nation. The rabbinical leadership said, so long as our ideals, our ideology is not in danger, we don't risk our lives. Surrender. Then we have what is referred to in the Gemara as the Biryonim, which is translated as people who like action, which is a critical way of labeling them. But these were real idealists who said that Jewish pride is something you fight for. Jewish self-rule you give your life for, even if your values are not in danger. This is a major disagreement. Do you give your life for Jewish nationalism, for self-rule? Is it only our values we fight for, or self-rule? Is that something to fight for? So what happened? There was civil war. When the Romans finally laid siege to Yerushalayim, they were fighting two different armies. Which of course made it a lot easier for them to conquer. The effect that had on our Masorah was that unlike the previous generations, where we had the rabbis studying under the leadership that came over from the previous generation for decades, day and night, asking them over and over, is it like this or is it like that? Precisely what does this rule mean? Which is the way the oral law was preserved. People did not have that kind of time nor the peace of mind to do so. What's interesting is that the Gemara is critical of the students of Hillel and Shammai for not spending more time with Hillel and Shammai. But 1 second, there was civil war. The Gemara understood that the future of the purity of the oral law should have been to them number one priority. Even more than determining whether or not to give our lives for self-rule. They shouldn't have gotten involved. They should have just stayed there and preserved the oral law and spend the time fine-tuning every rule. Spend the time with Hillel and Shammai to the very end. But it was at that era that many disagreements developed. Still, we're still talking about thousands, but the basis of the oral law, the definitions of almost every one of the 613 mitzvahs remained untampered with. They were intact. What was the basis of the disagreements? So I mentioned exactly how to use the Yud Gimel Midos Shatorah Nidreshes Bem, exactly how to deduce law from Torah Shebiksav. If you didn't have it just the right way, then you come to a different conclusion. After that happened, it was determined that we've got to do something to stop the further deterioration of the oral law. Now, there is a Torah commandment. I shouldn't say command, it's not one of the 613. But there's a pasuk in the Torah with regard to the oral law where it says, Sima befihem, place it in their mouths, it is to remain oral. Torah Shebal Peh, the oral law, is not to be written down. What does it mean it's not to be written down, and what's so important about not writing it? So much of the oral law is a matter of principles, sensitivities, subtleties. How do you teach them? By way of giving examples, making up cases. How do you teach law? How is law taught in law school? Cases. Here's this case, here's another one. Is the rule the same for both? Why? Why not? Notice the difference between the two cases? That's how you teach law. You want to give over the principles. You can't put them in words. They're too abstract to be put into words. It's not just a bunch of numbers. These are abstract concepts. The only way to give them over is by way of cases, examples. That is the medium. So there's a very big problem. Cases, examples, they are so subjective. They mean totally different things to different societies and in different generations. The proof of it being, today, when we study the Mishnah and the Gemara, we're trying to understand concepts by way of reading cases out of their lifestyle back in the days at the end of the Yishuv in Israel, as well as the lifestyle in Babylon, in Bavel, after the Second Temple era. It is so difficult to project onto our situations because we don't really grasp what it must have been like. There's so much in the Gemara that's talking about animals damaging one another, animals doing damage to property. Walking the streets meant walking side by side with cattle. Exactly what was that like? I mean, there were bulls walking the street, with their horns. These animals can kill, yet they were part of life. What was it like? What do we know? How do we go and apply these halachas to the rules of paying for damages in an automobile accident? It is so difficult. If we'd really grasp what it was like there, we'd really understand the principles and we'd have an easy time applying them. So to take any cases and make them sacred, to take any examples and make them sacred is dangerous. Because with the change in society, they would take on a new meaning. The principle will end up being compromised. The Torah doesn't allow, the issue is not putting it in writing. The issue is making any medium sacred, making any case or example sacred. Because once you do that, you're stuck. And if the way we relate to that particular example changes, then you're going to lose your understanding of the principle. You'll misinterpret it. What medium was used to give over Torah Shebaal Peh? The cases and examples were constantly changing. It was every teacher, and really every father, had to teach his children using examples that best illustrated the principles in that day. Rav Shri Ragon writes this. He says that everyone who taught, and the Torah holds every father responsible to teach his children, everyone who taught would be making up their own examples. So he'd be sure that the principle was pure. What this really means is it was the flexibility of the medium that kept the principles pure. So now at the end of the Second Temple era, where we had discrepancies, they were left with a dilemma. What do we do? Continue letting this process go on, where everyone's going to make up their own examples? Who knows how many disagreements there are going to be after a couple of generations from that? Especially the Jewish nation was now going to be dispersed all over the globe. The Torah predicted that. What's going to happen? How do we preserve the oral law? How do we see to it that it will remain intact, keeping in mind both things? That number one, if there is no standard text, it can go haywire. Number two, if there is, then we'll get caught up on the different meaning of the examples and we won't know the principles. We have to have something that's flexible. So they came up with a very important system, which is what Torah Sheval Peh is all about. On the one hand, they wrote things down. The Mishnah is a collection of cases. But it's a collection of cases filled with discrepancies. Along with that, you have to continue teaching using your own examples. But you had to check your understanding of the principle against the Mishnah. If your understanding of the principle could answer the discrepancies in the Mishnah, it was accurate. If it couldn't, you knew you were wrong. Meaning, if the principle would apply differently to two cases that were similar but slightly different, if your principle would show why they really are different, you're okay. But if your principle couldn't explain that, then you knew you were wrong. They first did this with the Mishnah, and then they saw that it was further deteriorating. There were still too many possibilities, and different people were interpreting the Mishnah differently. So they then wrote down the Gemara, which is in the form of conversation. The same way that the cases of the Mishnah may or may never have happened, the conversations in the Gemara didn't necessarily take place as they were written. The idea is to offer a commentary to Mishnah whereby, if the principles that you were giving over would make sense of the Gemara's interpretation of the Mishnah, then you knew they were accurate. And if not, not. But the oral tradition continued. This was true all the way to the end of the era of the Rishonim. The era of the Rishonim ends in Spain and Portugal for all the Sephardim with the Spanish Inquisition. And for the Ashkenazim, it ends with the pogroms, where Ashkenazi Jewry, by and large, left Germany and moved to Poland. Which means that throughout the era of the Tanoim, the ones who wrote the Mishnah, the Amoraim in the Gemara, followed by the Rabbanan Sfaroi, the Gaonim, and then the Rishonim, there was a live oral tradition that continued, which was constantly being checked against the Mishnah and the Gemara. At the end of the era of the Rishonim, we find that it just sort of disappeared, meaning the process of someone studying the entire oral law under a particular Rebbe, a teacher, and then checking that against the Mishnah, the Gemara, that wasn't working anymore. People were not able to spend so much time getting everything from their teachers. Post-Rishonim, the era since then, is called Achronim, the later ones. One of the first of the Achronim was Rabbi Yosef Karo. Rabbi Yosef Karo, although he had teachers, he writes there, which is such a drastic change from the Rishonim. Instead of saying under whom he studied, he tells us all the manuscripts that he was able to get hold of. In other words, he was reading the manuscripts of the Rishonim rather than having a live Torah Sheval Peh. And this is really an abrupt change. Through the era of the Rishonim, there was still an unbroken tradition, mouth to ear, of the entire oral law, alongside the Mishnah and the Gemara. After the Rishonim, it was a matter of manuscripts. And through the miracle of divine providence, what happened in that era was the invention of the printing press. So now you didn't have to get hold of manuscripts. Jews went crazy over the printing press. There were more Jewish-owned printing presses than non-Jewish ones. Because there was no longer a live oral tradition. You needed the printed word. If it was dependent on manuscripts, how many Jews would be able to see the handwritten manuscripts? Ever since the end of the era of the Rishonim, everything is text. How do we get our oral law? We read what the Rishonim said. Now, Rabbi Yosef Karo writes there, we've got a problem. In the olden days, you had one teacher. You studied under one Rishon. You studied under one Gaon. You studied under one Tana, one Amora. So you had an oral law that you considered accurate, and that's what you did. Today, we're reading all the manuscripts. How do we determine who's right? Whom do we follow? So he came up with the formula of, we find in the Sanhedrin, you go by the majority. See, he took what he considered the principal Rishonim and said that whatever the majority agrees on, that's what we do. And he wrote this all down in his Beit Yosef, and then wrote an outline of the Beit Yosef for purposes of review, which he called the Shulchan Aruch, the set table. That is the Shulchan Aruch we have today. At the same time, the Rav of Krakow in Poland had the same idea, except that rather than going by the majority of the Rishonim, he said we are to follow the last of the Rishonim because they saw all the earlier works and nevertheless they said what they said. And we find a Gemara like that. See, he went by the last of the Rishonim. He writes there that one day he went out to the market and he found that they were selling a book. They were selling the Beit Yosef. He hadn't quite finished his. And he said, wow, this is better than mine. So instead of putting out his book, he simply put out footnotes to the Shulchan Aruch explaining where he disagrees. And ultimately, the Beit Yosef, who was the Rav in Israel at the time, was followed by all of the Sephardim, except for the Yemenites. And Rav Moshe Isserlish, the Ramah of Krakow, was followed by the Ashkenazim, and that's the way it works to date. So understand now, and get this clear. Anything up until the end of the era of the Rishonim was a direct oral tradition from Moshe, along with the tradition of how to use the Yud Gimel Midos Shator Nidreshes Behem. Nobody was making anything up. Ever since the end of the Rishonim, we don't have that direct oral tradition. In how we interpret the written word, that is a matter of opinion. And today, that's why you can have poskim disagreeing with one another. How does one understand the Rambam? How does one understand the Ramban? How does one understand Rashi? See, now no longer is a matter of a live oral law where I can say, this is what I was taught by my Rebbe who was taught by, going all the way back to Moshe. Now I have to say is, I read it and this is the way I understand it. So we cannot disagree with Rishonim, but we are not bound by anybody else's interpretation of the Rishonim. This is basically what it's about. There's one other part to it, and that is that the Torah gives the rabbis the responsibility of creating fences and establishing ordinances to protect the Torah. That was sanctioned by the Torah. It was done in the days of the Sanhedrin. The first one to make rabbinical law was Moshe Rabbeinu. Most of the basic rabbinical law was made by Shlomo HaMelech. And then throughout the Sanhedrin, throughout the days that the Sanhedrin was around the Second Temple era, the first and then the Second Temple era. Whether or not rabbis today can make rabbinical law is questionable. The Sefer HaChinuch claims that when the Torah says you have to listen to the rabbis, it means even the rabbis of today. All the other Rishonim seem to disagree, and they say it's only the Sanhedrin. And that seems to be the prevalent opinion. And although there will be street signs all over Yerushalayim that you have to listen to the rabbis, and they said this and this, and they're talking about rabbis of today, the prevalent opinion is that is not rabbinical law. It may be a wise thing to do. You want to listen to wise people. But when the Torah sanctioned rabbinical law, according to most, that was referring to the Sanhedrin only. So this is the basic outline. Are there any questions? Is there anything bothering you? Yeah.
So basically, they didn't give a midot, or like what the rabbis had based their ruling and halachic opinion on.
Anything that was not carried on from generation to generation since Moshe, the rabbis would have to use the Yud Gimel Midot, and that's what it was all about.
Also, so the later Rishonim, they would they heard everything that the earlier ones had said, so they knew that it was almost like what did you say? It was like right, or it was like.
I didn't go into details there, but since you're mentioning, I should. All the Rishonim had a direct oral tradition. But the later Rishonim knew that they weren't alone. They understood that there were other traditions around. So, for example, the early Rishonim include Rabbeinu Hananel, the Rambam. He was the Rabbeinu Hananel was the Rebbe of Rabbi Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, the Rebbe of the Rimagash, who was the Rebbe of Maimon, who was the Rebbe of the Rambam. They were early Rishonim. On the other side, in France, there was Rabbeinu Gershon, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Yakar, and Rashi. They were the early ones. Rashi's grandchildren, the Balei HaTosfos, got hold of the manuscripts of the Rambam of Rabbeinu Hananel, and they also had the teachings that they got by way of Rashi. They compared the two and decided who they thought fit best into the words of the Gemara. So there it was the Rishonim, the later Rishonim were choosing from among the earlier Rishonim on the basis of what fit best into the words of the Gemara, what the Gemara was written for. So unlike Rashi and the Rambam, who just had a direct oral tradition, the later ones had a tradition, but they were also aware of other ones. And they picked and chose. Yeah.
Okay, so much trial and error throughout the process is kind of what I'm hearing. How do we know we're doing the right thing? And also, if the Torah, the written Torah told us not to write down the oral Torah, how could we get away with writing?
Oh, yes, because there was a rule that was put in there. On the one hand, which is when the Torah is in jeopardy, you can partially break the rules. And what they did is they wrote it down, but again, they did it in a way that if you're trying to get all the rules out of Torah Shebaal Peh, it's going to be very difficult. They wrote it down in a way that you still needed an oral tradition to accompany it. In other words, they were avoiding the problem that the Torah wanted us to avoid. Torah Shebaal Peh was written down in a very seemingly clumsy way, filled with discrepancies. And it's through those discrepancies that we're able to test the oral tradition that we have. Can we answer them? So you are allowed to partially break the Torah for the sake of the Torah. The essence of what the Torah had in mind, which is don't make any medium sacred so that you don't lose the message, that continued. Because they didn't write just a bunch of rules. Nobody has done that. Even the Rambam who claimed to have done that, he didn't do it either. He's also filled with discrepancy. He also buried discrepancies in everything he did. so that you would have to work through it and really figure out what he meant.
Is that why we wrote examples of the principle and not just the principle?
We didn't write, nobody writes the principles. There's no way you can write abstract principles, actually express it in words where you're not going to have a different way of interpreting it by everybody that reads it. You can't put abstract principles into words. You must have cases and examples. To this very day, that's the way law is taught. By the way, it's the same with values. What's Medrash all about? The stories of Medrash. They happened, they didn't. I mentioned this in the way back when. Did it happen? Did it not happen? Some did, some didn't. We don't care. That's not the purpose. Medrash is not a history book. Medrash is carrying the message of values by way of stories, some of which happened, some which didn't happen. You can't write a history book based on Medrash unless you're not writing history. But Medrash is totally accurate in terms of the message and the values it's trying to give over. Yeah.
So why would
Thank
the
you.
Tanaim and Amoraim leave so much wiggle room for so many commentators to, I guess, like decode the same thing differently?
In those days, there was still an oral tradition. They hoped that everyone would understand it together with the oral tradition. What happened is with the generations, the clarity deteriorated. And it's unfortunate. By the way, the Gemara says it's almost as if the Torah became more than one Torah. And that it ends off by saying it will not get back into being one Torah until Mashiach comes. That's what we're looking forward to. What we're looking forward to is clarity, because we are left with, again, the basic definition of the 613. There's almost never a discrepancy, almost. Most mitzvahs, we know what they are. It's only in details. But when it comes to the details, there's so much disagreement. And the question was, how do we know we're right? We don't. We may be wrong. For all we know, we're wrong. We don't know. We have to do our best. When Mashiach comes, we're going to find out the truth. By the way, how is it going to work that? They'll reestablish the Sanhedrin, that's number one. But it says that Eliyahu Hanavi will answer our questions. A prophet cannot answer questions. The Gemara says, Lo b'shamayim hi. The Pasuk writes, it's not in heaven. The Gemara says, a Navi cannot come along and tell you what the halacha is. You see, Eliyahu Hanavi lived a long time ago. Eliyahu Hanavi lived in the Second Temple era, before there were any discrepancies. He got a direct Masorah of Torah Shebal Peh before there were any disagreements. He's not coming with prophecy. Although he's a prophet, he is going to be able to tell us what he was taught, which at that point was without any disagreement. He's got the entire oral law clear. Yeah.
So how do we ever know who to pass it?
That's why the Shulchan Aruch went one way, the Ramah went the other way. What we do today is you either follow, if you have a Rav, you're supposed to follow him, and he's supposed to know enough to decide for himself, or you do what mainstream Orthodox Jewry does. It's one or the other. Mainstream meaning either your community, your larger community, your smaller community. Communities today are no longer geographic. Communities today are very much like, what do you identify with? But it's one or the other. Either you are a direct rabbi, you just follow what he tells you, or you follow what's done. What's done by people that know what they're doing. Right? What's people that if people just break halacha, that's not called what's done. Okay, I hope this was clear. With the guys, we go further. And we tell them that they've got to study and learn how to analyze text and study the Gemara and study the Rishonim and then decide for themselves what to do. Now, they're supposed to know that. The only thing is it takes years and years of learning before you're capable of doing that yourself. But in theory, that's really the responsibility of every male. Every Jewish man is really supposed to go and determine the halacha, from Torah Shebal Peh, from all the way down to the works of the end of the works of the Rishonim. It's a difficult process. Yeah.
What's the importance of them doing it themselves and not just?
Great question. The truth of the matter is that although there's only one truth, there are many different flavors to that truth. There are many different ways of doing the same thing. For example, what is a Shabbos table supposed to look like? The mitzvah of Onik Shabbos, what's that supposed to look like? I'm just giving that as an example because it's an obvious one, but it's true with regard to almost everything in Torah. Everyone's got a different shorish haneshama. There's the root of your soul. It's deep-rooted in your spiritual personality. And really, everyone is supposed to find that for themselves. And just listening to someone else doesn't quite do it. The Torah says if you can't do it, you can go and ask a question and you go by it. Ki polei mimcha davar. If there's something you cannot figure out, you're allowed to go ask someone else. But ideally, you're supposed to go and live it the way your neshama tells you to. And by the way, this is true for women also, except that the text of the Gemara was written by men for men. That's not the way women study principles. The oral tradition for women was handed down orally, from grandmother to granddaughter over the generations. Unfortunately, that stopped, and instead we have formal education. And the problem is that we don't really have a text that's suitable for women that has the entire oral law. Yeah.
Where do the Karaites, the people that don't believe in Torah Shebal Peh, fall into this situation?
It was the Sadducees and then the Karaites. They were always, a fringe group. They were never part of mainstream of mainstream Jewry, and they just denied the oral law. They had a very hard time because if you deny the oral law, then there's nothing you can really do. The Torah says to wear totafos. What are they? If there's no oral law, what are tefillin supposed to look like? What are tzitzis supposed to look like? The laws of shechita. How do you slaughter an animal?
I agree. So how did they simply ignore all that?
They made one up of their own. And they were very much pushed out of the nation because it was clear that they were far from mainstream. And then we had the Baitusim. They were worse. They were just not serious. They actually scorned the whole system. So that when we know that Shavuos is on the 50th day after Pesach, they said no. The Torah says, Mimachras HaShabbos, you start counting the 50 day, the 49 days from the day after Pesach. They said no, it's the day after Shabbos. And why is that? That Shavuos is always supposed to be on a Sunday because Moshe Rabbeinu wanted everyone to have an extended weekend. That's what they said. It was written in the Gemara. They were not serious. We always looked at the Tzedokah and the Baitusim. We saw these as people that were not, and then later the Karaites, as people that were really not serious. Where they come from? The Tzedokah and the Sadducees were actually Talmidim of Antignos, and they misinterpreted something that he said, and that started a whole commotion. The Karaites are historically, they came about because the leadership in Babylon, we're talking about in the first couple of centuries, fifth century and so, it was in the hands of the Gaonim, and they were sanctioned by the local government. So there was this one Gaon who said he was supposed to be a leader, and declared himself one of the Gaonim. His name was Anan. And then he was arrested by the government because they said that he was not recognized by the Jews and he was posing as a leader when he wasn't. So what he did was he declared, well, I'm not the leader of the Jews, I'm the leader of the Karaites, which is a sister religion to Judaism. That's where the Karaites came from. It was founded by Anan as a way of preserving his own life so he could say that he was a leader and not be executed. I know this sounds like character assassination, but historically that's actually what happened. But the Sadducees and the Karaites were never mainstream. They were always a fringe group. They were always a fringe group. The nation as a whole knew what it was doing.
So how did they make it until today?
Had they?
Make it? Like how are they still?
The Karaites, there's not much. They were. I think they peaked in the days of the Rambam. The Rambam saw it necessary to refute them. You know any Karaites today? There are a handful of them. There's a Karaite shul in the old city. They haven't had a minyan in generations.
Do they need a minion?
For some strange reason, they believe you do. It's just so, we don't understand. Like, if there is no oral law, where'd they get their rules from? They wear tefillin, but they wear them on their noses. Because the Torah says, bein einecha, between your eyes. And they interpret that as what's between your eyes, your nose. So they put it on their nose. At the same time, they wear tefillin. How do they know what tefillin are? Torah just says totavos, doesn't say anything more. Without an oral law, how do you know what tefillin are? So again, the mainstream Klal Yisrael never took them seriously. So that over other generations, there were Jews that were non-observant. They found it easier to identify themselves as non-observant than to identify themselves as Karaites. Okay.